Welcome back to iGen Politics. This is a podcast that makes politics engaging and relevant for all generations. This is Victor Shi.
And I'm Jill Wine Banks, and today's Jill's pin is a pin of the Supreme Court. And the reason for that is because today we're talking about the importance of state Supreme Court elections in Wisconsin.
So just because it's not a midterm or presidential election year does not mean there aren't still elections happening across the country. Even though it's 2023, there are numerous important state and local elections happening throughout the United States. And today we want to highlight one of the most important ones, and that is the Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. Early voting is already underway, and Election Day is exactly 7 weeks away from today. Currently, the Wisconsin state legislature is controlled by Republicans, and the governor is a Democrat. And the Supreme Court is comprised of 7 members elected to 10-year terms. 2 are up for re-election, and the differences between the candidates' views on critical issues, especially abortion, are stark, even though the election is technically nonpartisan.
So I still remember when we didn't talk about partisanship or the views of justices in even the US Supreme Court. But today we have the perfect guest to talk about what it means that this is a nonpartisan race, the importance of this race, and what Democrats must do in the remaining 7 weeks to make sure that the Supreme Court does not tip Republican and eviscerate abortion and probably other rights as well. So today's guest is Ben Wikler, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. He's been a guest on this show before. He's been a leading voice on everything related to Wisconsin politics, including, of course, what's happening now with the Supreme Court election. We're so glad to have him back today. And I believe that the first time was before the 2020 election, which seems like 1,000 years ago. It's great to have you back. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you so much, Victor. I'm excited that people are talking about a Supreme Court race because this is the kind of election that Republicans have been obsessed with and that have gotten them enormous power far from the national spotlight. And in this moment, if Republicans continue with their hammerlock on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, they have a majority they've had for the last 12 years. It makes it very, very difficult to ever have the possibility of Wisconsin being a democracy where the majority of the voters could win a majority of the legislative seats. If we win this, it opens up a new path for freedom and democracy in the state that's been the tipping point in both of the last 2 presidential elections. So this is a big moment for us. And I given the ramifications of what happens in Wisconsin for the rest of the country, I think it's a big moment for the nation. And I'm so glad to be on with you.
Yeah. And as our neighbor, I'm in Illinois, so you're our neighbor. And so many people from Indivisible and other organizations in Illinois are working in Wisconsin because it is recognized. But I want to start with sort of a background thing here, because I keep reading that it's nonpartisan, and yet I keep reading that there are 2 people who are Democrats and 2 candidates who are Republicans. And so I don't get why. And I will also say that I looked up the ballot for my goddaughter who lives in Wisconsin, and it does not identify any of the candidates other than by name. So that how do people even know who's the Democrat and the Republican? Tell me how this is nonpartisan.
So you've put your finger on the issue. So it's nonpartisan in the sense that the candidates don't declare when they register and file to run what their partisan affiliation is, and the ballot doesn't say it. So voters have no way of knowing who lines up with their values except for what they hear from volunteers knocking on their door, from ads that they see on TV and on their phones, from postcards they get in the mail from folks across the country. That's the only way people find out. And the reality is that there are 2 candidates in this race who are running as conservatives. That's the word they keep using. And then they do nod, nod, wink, wink about what that means. One of them talks about how she volunteered when her husband ran as a Republican for the state assembly. The other one literally worked for the Republican Party of Wisconsin. They were both appointed by Scott Walker, if that tells you anything. They both went to Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting University, now called Regent University. They're both endorsed by the ultra mega hard right anti-abortion groups in our state that want to ban abortion with no exceptions whatsoever. They are Republicans. They're ultra mega Republicans, but voters won't know that unless they find out from the work that everyone listening and I and everyone I work with and the campaigns do to educate them about who the far right Republican extremists are in this race. And for the other 2 candidates,
something in writing to take into the voting booth, because not only are their names similar, there are two female candidates, both named begin with a J, Jennifer and Judy. I could see how easy Janet and Jennifer. See how easy it is to confuse those. And it worries me that they might not remember when they get in and go, oh, wait, which was the conservative one? So I'm wondering if you are passing out something for them to bring in.
Palm cards, lit pieces. We have folks going door to door every weekend with these, pieces of paper that show Janet Protasewicz and Everett Mitchell. Those are the two progressives in the Supreme Court race. As their photo, it has their name, and it explains the stakes in the race, which, to start with, Wisconsin has an abortion ban with almost no exceptions that was passed in the year 1849, before women had the right to vote. And the Supreme Court will decide whether that should be enforceable or not. And this is as close as Wisconsin gets to having a Kansas abortion referendum. We don't have a referendum process in Wisconsin. We have state Supreme Court races. So our job as the Democratic Party is to make sure voters know who the candidates are who line up with their values. We're neutral between Janet and Everett, but we are not neutral between them and the ultra MAGA candidates on the ballot. And getting that name recognition up so that folks know, essentially where the dividing line is, that is the critical work of this next week, and then of the next 6 weeks for the general election. So we're in a primary 1 week from today, on the 21st of February. The top two vote winners will go on to the general election. We will probably endorse.
How many vacancies are there?
Yeah, what's that?
Two vacancies or one?
One vacancy.
One vacancy. Okay. Oh, all right. So you could have two Democrats running. Or
you could have two progressives. Yeah, you could have two conservatives, two progressives. I think that's pretty unlikely, just given that the electorate is pretty split between the two. If you ask people who wants to vote, about half the people who say they want to vote are Democrats, half are Republicans, and we've already broken the record for primary campaign spending in this race. So people are starting to get a pretty good sense of who the Republicans and who the Democrats are. So by far the most likely scenario is one Republican, one Democrat get through to the general election.
So you mentioned at the beginning, this election is particularly unique because it comes against the backdrop of a Democrat-controlled executive branch and a Republican-controlled executive branch. And as we all know, Republicans tend to focus a lot on the courts and judicial races. Talk to us about the role that the Supreme Court typically plays in Wisconsin politics and how you're seeing the Republicans kind of strategize around this election.
Republicans for the last 12 years have essentially used the state Supreme Court as a third branch of the Republican-controlled state legislature. So what that means is they push through often pretty unconstitutional laws with illegal means. They call special sessions of the legislature in violation of state statute. They do all kinds of stuff. And the state legislature can get away with it because the state Supreme Court has operated essentially as a branch of the Republican Party. So they upheld, for example, a set of laws that after our Democratic governor, Tony Evers, was elected, before he was sworn in, Scott Walker, the Republican governor, and the state legislature convened a special session and grabbed a bunch of powers away from the sitting governor, from the incoming governor and the incoming Democratic attorney general, and gave those powers to the state legislature. And when that was challenged in court on totally legitimate grounds, the state Supreme Court said, hey, no problem here. Just take those powers away from the Democrats and give them to Republicans. We've seen things like that over and over. Republicans couldn't get laws through to ban drop boxes, for example, for absentee ballots last year. So the state Supreme Court decided to do it because Governor Evers, vetoed those kinds of bills, and then the state Supreme Court did it instead. Same thing with gerrymandered maps. Republicans in the state legislature passed super gerrymandered maps. Governor Evers vetoed them, and then the state Supreme Court said, well, let's just use those maps anyway. We now have the worst partisan gerrymander in the country. And Republicans have used it as an end run around democracy so that the person who has been elected now twice with a majority of the public to be the governor, Republicans don't think that his word should be final. They think that their judges should do the dirty work for them.
Wow.
So that's where we are right now. But if we win the majority, all that could change because if we have a majority of Supreme Court justices who actually look at the law and the Constitution and not just the Republican Party platform, we could have an opportunity for starters, to strike down the gerrymandered maps as unconstitutional, which they frankly are, and then have fair maps and have a shot at actually, winning majorities if we win the elections.
Yeah, it seems to me there are two really key areas of concern that the Supreme Court of Wisconsin could be involved in. And you mentioned both of them already, sort of democracy issues, including gerrymandering, and also abortion. And then I want to ask about the composition of the court. But before I do that, I want to just clarify for our listeners something which may be obvious to us, but may not be so obvious. And that is, when you mentioned that there's a law that has gone into effect from the 1800s, and that's not, I'm not misstating that, it is 18, not 19, not 20. And that is because after Roe, it went away. It was unconstitutional, but it never went away. And once there was no more Roe, it was like, okay, we're bringing it back. And so it's really a draconian, strict law. And I just want our listeners to understand how you could be talking about an 1800 law. And that's because the Supreme Court of the United States protected women from that in Wisconsin. And now that protection is gone. But let's look at before we get to the democracy issues, the current Supreme Court, it was surprising to me, is now 6 women and only 1 man. All are white. The candidates are a little more diverse. There is 1 white male, 1 black male, and 2 white females. And they divide up in a way that could possibly change at least the balance from 6 women, which is just astounding. Is that something that's of concern or of interest to the voters?
It's interesting. In both parties, there's 1 man and 1 woman. In the Democratic Party, it's a African-American man and a white woman. The Republican candidates are both white. I think the issue of abortion is going to be front and center, and both Janet Protasiewicz and Everett Mitchell have a very powerful message about that. And both Republicans are incredibly right-wing on this issue and support this total abortion ban, or that their endorsers certainly do, and very enthusiastically. So the questions around the identities of the candidate, I think, are things that voters certainly look at and think about. Mm-hmm. But the vast gulf on the issues is enormous, right? So we've had a 4-3 conservative majority for the last few years, and since 2020, when we won a Supreme Court race. That 4-3 conservative majority has the Chief Justice, Pat Roggensack, who's 81. She's retiring. So that leaves 3-3 with an open seat. And that's what this election will fill. So this will, if we win, we flip the majority from 4-3 conservative to 4-3 progressive. If we lose, it stays the way it was. I'll share another piece of why this matters so much to us. After 2020, Donald Trump sued to overturn the election results, as he did in many states. But in other states, those suits were thrown out, and laughed out of court. In Wisconsin, the state Supreme Court came within 1 vote of taking up Trump's lawsuit. There's one very conservative justice who occasionally swings over to the other side in the most egregious circumstances. He voted for their gerrymandered maps and everything else, but he was the one who said, no, we won't throw out the ballots and hand Wisconsin to Trump. That is too close for comfort. And if we win this, then we avoid the risk that a presidential election could be overturned in our state. So those issues around democracy and abortion rights are really the biggest things. If you look at what Republicans are doing in this campaign, it is all exactly what we saw last year, 100% a fear campaign about crime. And that's really their only playbook on the Republican side. And we have to expect it to get pretty ugly before the final election day on April 4th. But if we can keep this race focused on the freedoms of voters to have control over their own bodies, to participate in our democracy, then that is winning ground for the progressives who line up with the values of most Wisconsinites across party.
I think that's super important, for all of us, I think on this right now, and all of our listeners and watchers, I think we can feel the stakes of the election and know why it's so important. But kind of going back to something that I mentioned earlier, I mean, for Democrats, it's like the courts and the kind of judicial races just really aren't as, I guess, immediate, or maybe we don't really pay as much attention as Republicans do. So are you finding it now with 50 days before election day that Democrats are more motivated than you've seen before around this Supreme Court race and just, I guess, court races in general?
People are fired up in this state. And I think that it's for painful reasons. It's because we've seen such terrible decisions over and over and over. To give one example, in 2020, right before the state Supreme Court election, the governor, the COVID pandemic had just hit, and poll workers were dropping out because they were worried about contracting COVID at the polling place. So polling places in Milwaukee, we went from 168 to just 5 because so many poll workers had dropped out. And the governor said, this is ridiculous. We cannot run an election in these circumstances. Let's delay the election, mail everyone a ballot, do this safely the way that the people are doing in other states, the way that Mike DeWine, the Republican governor of Ohio, ordered to be done in his state. And the state Supreme Court, the day before the election, overruled Governor Evers and said, no, this election has to happen tomorrow. And, for anyone paying attention to Wisconsin politics, that moment will be seared in our brains. We've seen a Supreme Court that has no regard for the lives of Wisconsinites, the rights of Wisconsinites. And I think because of that, it's been pummeled into us. You have to care about Supreme Court races the same way we do about presidential and governor and Senate races and all these other races that get a lot more headlines. So I think we're going to have high voter turnout. I think it's going to be highly engaged. We cannot take anything for granted because Republicans also, they know the stakes. They've used those stakes. They've used that power.
Yeah.
It's how they've cemented their control of the state legislature and thus the control of our state's purse strings and so much else. So both sides are really engaged in this fight. And I'm just glad that our side isn't sitting it out, which is, I think, really the risk when Democrats, tune into the president and nothing else. We will show up. And every person who volunteers can make a difference, because when you call voters, you're calling people who are strong Democrats, but who might not know that this election's happening. So a single call can yield an extra vote in the primary and the general election. Our voters are having a great experience calling folks, and anyone who wants to sign up for a phone bank should go to wisdems.org/volunteer to get involved.
Say that again, where people can go to help. Please repeat.
So it's WisDems, Wisconsin Democrats, wisdems.org/volunteer. And when you go to that link, you'll see a whole bunch of different things you can sign up for. Just sign up for the one that's most convenient, and we will put you to work.
Please do that. It is really crucial, and it does make a difference. I think, am I right? This is the only election right now in Wisconsin is for the Supreme Court, or are there other local races?
This is the only statewide election. There are many local elections. So to take one example, the mayor of Green Bay is up and is facing a challenge from a well-funded Republican. There are mayor's races, city council races, school board races. There's a special election for state senate in the suburbs north of Milwaukee that will determine whether Republicans have a supermajority in the state senate under the gerrymandered maps. So there's lots of other things to vote for. I think most Wisconsinites, when they look at their ballot, they will only see the Supreme Court race because different cities have their elections at different moments. But, in Madison, Milwaukee, and lots of different cities, there will be municipal races as well.
Yes, I put in my goddaughter's address to check what her ballot would look like, and it is only the Supreme Court. Now, she knows how important it is, and she is volunteering and being active. But please, everybody, go to that website and try to get involved in this race, but also throughout Wisconsin in local elections, because I think, as Ben has mentioned, the Republicans have realized the importance of state Supreme Courts and local offices like the school board. If you don't want books banned in your school district, then you have to get involved in the local school board election. And that's very important.
So let's turn to the issue of abortion. We mentioned it a little bit before, but I'm wondering if you think that this abortion issue is motivating Democrats, Republicans, or both, as it did in Michigan.
I think it's motivating both, but it's motivating Democrats more, and it's motivating some Republicans to vote for Democrats. The striking thing about this issue is that Wisconsin's abortion ban is so extreme that for most independents and for some Republicans, it's a reason to actually cross over and vote for the other side. For some people that might not vote, it's a reason to get up off the couch and cast a ballot. If you are, a hardcore anti-abortion activist, Wisconsin is perfect right now because we have potentially this abortion ban that starts at 0 weeks, has no exceptions for cases of rape or incest or the health of the mother. It's so extreme that there are OBGYN practices that are closing right now. In Barron, Wisconsin, we just had one that closed. You can't finish training to be an OBGYN without leaving the state because, the term abortion refers to the standard of care in cases of ectopic pregnancy and miscarriages. It's not clear. The law was written before the advent of modern medicine. It appears to refer to that kind of care as well. So women are being denied routine care, even who are not trying to terminate a pregnancy. And then, of course, if you are trying to end a pregnancy, you can't get that care in any clinic in the state right now. So Planned Parenthood what they do is they help people figure out how to go to Illinois or Minnesota or some other state. It's pretty tough. And there are a lot of families, people who already have kids who want to have another, who are wondering, do they want to actually keep living in Wisconsin if they're afraid of whether they can get the care they need if something happens during their pregnancy. Now, the thing about this law that was passed in the year 1849, there are other laws that have passed later on during the Roe versus Wade era. And it's not clear whether those laws supersede the old law. It seems to me like they should. The Attorney General has sued and said the old law is unenforceable because these new laws supersede it. If we have justices on our state Supreme Court who believe in following the law and the Constitution, the old law will be rendered unenforceable. And we could, enter the 21st century again. If these ultra mega Republicans get on the Supreme Court, we already pretty much know how they will rule. They'll say that, it's time to go back to 1849 before women had the right to vote, when this law was originally passed. So that is, it is so stark and it's so personal for so many people, for so many families, for people who want to have families, for people who knew what it was like in the battle days. I was talking to one volunteer who was telling me that her grandmother died. She already had children, but she died getting an abortion because she wasn't able to have the next child before the era of Roe versus Wade. It was an illegal abortion during the era of Wisconsin's abortion ban. And those stories are passed person to person through communities across the state of Wisconsin. And that makes this issue explosive, and rightly so. It's an issue that should motivate people to vote. And it could be decisive in this election in the way that it played a huge role, I think, in the governor's race last year.
Right. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, your Democratic Attorney General and Governor are suing to overturn the state law. And there are also cases in other jurisdictions. There's one that was brought because a woman who has had several dangerously bad pregnancies and is worried that if she were miscarrying, she would die because she would be deprived of having an abortion, and is therefore abstaining from becoming pregnant. And that's another lawsuit. And then, of course, there's now this challenge to the way that 50% of all Americans have an abortion is through medication, not surgery. And there's a challenge to that being brought, that the FDA approved it improperly, which is absurd. So I just want people to know that there are lawsuits being brought to try to bring back some of the rights that have been lost under Dobbs. But I'm glad to know that it's motivating people right now, and that hopefully your message is getting across that this is an issue that can be determined by the outcome of this election.
Absolutely. And we're finding that it's an issue that's resonating, and it's an issue that's getting people to sign up for those volunteer shifts, to chip in contributions. It makes a huge difference whether we have the money to communicate with people. And it looks like it will be a really powerful issue to shape votes.
Yeah. And it does give me a lot of comfort that you said that some of the Republicans are also voting for Democrats. And I think part of that probably, and I don't know if you think this is true, but after Kansas last year, that special election, they framed abortion as kind of the difference between freedom and not, and I guess the I guess, lack of ability that you have to choose what you want to do with your own body. And so I guess maybe that freedom framing is pretty kind of motivating for a bunch of Democrats, but also maybe Republicans to switch over. And hopefully that's the case this time around.
It's freedom is as an American, the message you can get, and it's something that is such a deeply held value for people across the political spectrum. I think this really is kind of our Wisconsin's version of the Kansas abortion referendum is this Supreme Court election. When you look at what happened last November in Wisconsin, normally Democratic turnout falls enormously in midterms with a Democratic president. And because of a huge effort to turn out Democrats, we came close to matching Republicans, but it was still a Republican tilted electorate by about 2 percentage points. And yet Mandela Barnes lost by only 1 point and Governor Evers won by 3.4 points. That's because independents and some Republicans crossed over and voted for Democrats in these elections, even though there were more Republicans voting than Democrats. And that, I think this issue was a front and center reason why some folks did exactly that. So
you mentioned freedom, which brings us to maybe the democracy issues that are at stake in this election as a result of how this comes out. Wisconsin's still a swing state, and it was at the heart of the effort, as you mentioned, to overturn the 2020 election. And luckily, you held against the Trump pressure. But do we know if the Republican Supreme Court candidates believe in the big lie, if they would be on the side of accepting some of the arguments that have been made, the independent state legislature theory, et cetera?
This is a key question, and they are keeping their lips pretty sealed about this. But I can tell you based on everything from them, if it came down to another lawsuit like we had after 2020, I would be blown away if they didn't support the big lie position. They've both been endorsed by people who did support the big lie position, who are currently sitting members of their state Supreme Court. They've been backed by organizations that have been pushing the big lie stuff, by right-wing talk radio hosts who are pushing the big lie stuff. Like, they are fully immersed in that movement. And that, to me, is one reason why this is a code red election. If we get into a constitutional crisis, I don't think that we can count on them to put country ahead of party, even though it's supposed to be nonpartisan. And that, on top of everything else, is yet another red line that I don't think that we can safely cross. This is also interesting politically because while most of the Republican establishment and a lot of the hardcore members of the Republican base are fully kind of on board with Trump's election denialism, there are some principled conservatives who are right-wing on every issue, including abortion rights in many cases, for whom this is a bridge too far. And the belief in our Constitution and the idea that we should have rule of law in this country and the peaceful transfer of power led some Republicans to cross over and vote in the governor's race last year about this. I think that might also happen in the Supreme Court race. So that's, alongside the freedom to access safe and legal abortion, there's going to be a fundamental argument about the freedom of being part of a democracy that I think is going to be a big part of this battle.
So in the same vein as that, you also mentioned that Wisconsin is the most gerrymandered state in the nation. Walk us through some of the gerrymandering and also redistricting cases that could make it to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and what would happen if Republicans do control the court in that scenario?
The state of Wisconsin is so gerrymandered that even though Democrats have won 14 out of the last 17 statewide elections, that's more than 80%, they have less than 35% of the legislative seats. Wisconsin Democrats have, I guess we have 35% of the state assembly seats. If Republicans win the special election coming up, we'll have only 33% of the state Senate seats. And we're right on the cusp of having Republican supermajorities in both legislative chambers. And I should say, Republicans have 6 of the 8 congressional seats. All of that is the result of these district maps that were laser etched onto the state by Republicans to guarantee Republican control, even if they were losing a majority of the votes, which has happened multiple times. The Democrats win more votes and Republicans get more legislative seats. That is, I think, a pretty flagrant violation of several guarantees in our state constitution, but it's how Republicans in the legislature and the state Supreme Court like it. They don't want to have to answer to a general electorate. They just want to think about Republican primaries. If we elect a pro-constitution, pro-democracy state Supreme Court, majority, and the constitutionality of our maps is challenged potentially later this year, the state Supreme Court could deem these maps unconstitutional and demand maps that meet some kind of standard of fairness. That's what happened in Pennsylvania. You folks probably saw the Pennsylvania Democrats just won control of the state assembly there in the series of elections that took place after 2022's general election. So we could switch from preventing Republican supermajorities to actually being a democracy where each side is fighting to win a majority in the state legislature. And that would change everything. Not only could it open the door to Democrats having a Democratic trifecta and passing laws, it would also make it so that Republicans had to think about whether they might alienate Democrats in their districts and independents in their districts if they did something really bad. So I think it could have a moderating impact on Republicans if they had actually competitive districts and not just hyper gerrymandered districts that guaranteed their reelection. This is for the long-term future of the state, touching every issue that affects any Wisconsinite's life. The question of gerrymandered maps is fundamental, and that is on the line with this election too.
Okay, so are there any other issues you want your voters to know about that could be affected by the outcome of the Supreme Court race?
I mean, just about every issue comes in front of our Supreme Court at one time or another. Issues around climate change, issues around racial justice and equity, issues around public safety. There's so many different issues that are going to come before the state Supreme Court. But the questions of democracy and freedom kind of touch all of those things. And I think if the number one thing I want is for folks to go into the polling place thinking about whether we should have a Supreme Court that upholds American freedom or one that is part of this kind of autocratic far-right Republican operation that is taking people's freedoms away. If folks know those are the states, I'm confident that we'll win.
Well, this was such an amazing episode, and thank you so much for all that you're doing to raise awareness about this. Everyone, go to wisdems.org/volunteer, get involved, go to Wisconsin if you're in the neighboring states, make phone calls. There's so many ways to get involved. Ben, thank you so much for shedding light on the Supreme Court race, and best of luck to you and the Democratic Party, and hopefully we can get Democrats elected.
That sounds good. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Can I just say that
I
say it's WISCDEMS, WISC Dems. It's not
WISC Dems.
Yeah, WISC Dems.
No, is it WISC Dems or is it? Hold on, I'm actually trying it for myself because when I search up WISC Dems, it's it is WISC Dems /volunteer. So WIS no C DEM no C. Yes, exactly. Well, that was a great episode. I think generally, Jill, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, one of the things I think that, and I sent you this article last week was the State of the Union, and Kate Shaw wrote this great piece about how Democrats generally don't really talk about the Supreme Court, don't really talk about the courts. And so I hope this marks a change in terms of how Democrats approach Supreme Court elections and view Supreme Court elections. I'm wondering, in your lifetime, have you ever felt a moment when Democrats really cared about the courts as much as Republicans? And do you think it's changing now?
I do think it's changing. I think what we're seeing now is the reality has set in that the Republicans have spent the last more than a decade working on local elections and court appointments. And I want to point out that today marks a new record for appointments, that President Biden has gotten his, I think it's 100th.
Yep, 100th
nominee confirmed. And that outpaces what Donald Trump did in the same time period. He's going to have to keep it up, though. And it's really important. I think all Americans are seeing the importance of who sits on the courts and whether they are qualified and whether they are unbiased in their viewpoint and are going to stick to precedent and the real rules of the law. So I think for the first time, we're seeing more and more Democrats interested in school board elections because of the banning of books, the change in curriculum, the stuff that's going on in Florida with DeSantis and the advanced placement courses. I mean, there's just a lot going on that is making us realize that it's not the glamour of the federal government, that really your life is affected in the most dramatic ways by
on the state and local levels,
on a city or a county
Yep.
or a village level. And so please, guys, pay attention to this and remember to sign up to volunteer for this.
Yeah, and I think especially having abortion on the ballot, I mean, it's not literally on the ballot this election, but it's very much connected to this race and what it would mean for the future of abortion. I think for young people too, I think young people are definitely paying attention to the Supreme Court and also just courts in general, seeing what happened with that Supreme Court overturning the right to an abortion, I think was startling for everyone, but especially this generation that thought that it would be a guarantee, but clearly is not. And so I hope people in Wisconsin really pay attention. They go out there and they vote and they volunteer before election day to turn out all of their friends as well. And I know your goddaughter is also a college student. So is she sending her ballot into Wisconsin from Portland, Oregon?
Well, it's my grand goddaughter. My goddaughter is yeah, my goddaughter is a therapist and very involved in Wisconsin politics, supporting candidates and going door to door. And my grand goddaughter is not in state right now, but she is voting. Yes.
Yes. Via absentee, which is another option.
Yes, exactly.
So let's talk about some of the other news of the day. I know we were last night, we were talking about the tragic news out of Michigan State University. So far, at least 3 people are confirmed dead. 5 others are injured. And it's just hard to, look at this situation without remembering that exactly 5 years ago was the Parkland shooting. And, we've talked about a lot on this show, our nation's unique problem with gun violence. 5 years later, really nothing has gotten better. And I'm wondering, Jill, if you have any hope left in this moment, because it's like, you're hearing a lot of Republicans offer thoughts and prayers, but will this be the moment where we finally have change? Young people, and Elisa Slotkin, who we both saw on last Friday at U Chicago, she gave a great press conference this morning and said, the reality is that you either care about students and young people or you don't. You care about children or you don't. And it seems like Republicans don't. And I hate to make it political, but unfortunately it is, because you have an entire party that is beholden to the NRA and power and money. And I just don't know if it's going to change.
I really am stumped by this one. I am appalled. And this year we have at least, and by the way, this does not count as a mass shooting, which requires 4 dead other than the shooter. In this case, the shooter is shot himself as well. He's also dead, but he doesn't count toward that. It is appalling that we have had 1 mass shooting, more than 1 a day.
Can I share a quick statistics? Robert Reich posted this really startling comparison over the years of the number of mass shootings that we've had. In 2014, we had 273 mass shootings, which is already way too high. In 2022, we had 647 mass shootings. Less than 10 years later, that number increased almost 400. In the first 7 weeks of 2023, we've had 67.
It's what can you say? Guns kill. And I don't care what the NRA says. If guns weren't so readily available, people wouldn't be dead in these numbers. And, we don't have the information, or at least I don't right now, on the Michigan shooting as to what type of weapon he used or what his motives were. Or what his intents were. He apparently had a letter that targeted 2 schools in New Jersey where he had previously been. So I don't want to draw any conclusions about his motives or anything right now, but it's still 1 more death than we need. It is actually 3 more deaths than we need. And I'm saddened by this, and I am hopeful. It came close to your home and my home when the Highland Park shooter on July 4th. It's way too close for my comfort, and I think that it's time. And your generation is doing a good job in fighting for this. Maybe your generation, Democrat and Republican, will see that the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia.
Yeah, exactly,
And I'm
exactly.
sorry, but you can't, if you want to be an originalist, pay attention to the actual word
Yeah,
there. And this is
all the textualists out there.
exact.
Yes.
So please, folks, pay attention.
There's an interesting. I was listening to someone on MSNBC today, and she was talking about the response to this. And I forgot what her name was, but she was talking about the response to this. And I mean, how are we imagining what college campuses will look like after this? Are we going to install metal detectors in every single building? Are students going to have to go through drastic measures just to feel safe? I mean, you have an entire generation where it's the lockdown generation where we have to go through lockdown drills, school shootings. I mean, it's just scary because colleges are supposed to be a place where young people, students can just be free and not have to worry about anything. But I mean, I wonder how colleges are going to respond to this because no college is immune. If it can happen at MSU, it can happen anywhere. And it's hard to control what happens at colleges and make people feel safe. But is the option now, I mean, everyone has to go through some sort of metal detection system or get checked that they don't have a gun.
Because with high-powered weapons, you can shoot from outside into the building. And
Yeah,
there's no way you can restrict the entire campus from
right.
people. And you have a 6-year-old who brought a gun to school and shot his teacher. So
Yeah.
it's not just colleges that we need to worry about. It is all schools, but it's also, when we look at the mass shootings of this year, it's nightclubs, it's Walmarts, it's
Yeah.
everywhere,
Literally.
and the 4th of July parade, which was
Yeah.
outdoors, of course. So
I mean, is there anywhere that we can feel safe anymore? It seems like every single place where people congregate publicly or where we just do our normal
Yeah.
activities has been shot at. It's really
yeah. I mean, Congress, get busy. That's all I
Yeah.
can say. We have
Yeah.
to pay attention, and as we acknowledge and commemorate the anniversary of Parkland and think about all of the tragedies of the last few months, everywhere across the country, people driving, Texas, Buffalo, think about all the places, Florida,
Yeah.
where there have been mass shootings, and that is defined as at least 4 dead. That's
Yeah.
horrible. California
Yeah.
had multiples in 1 week. So we need to be much more careful, and we need to strengthen our laws to prevent it. And it has to be a national law because
Yeah.
Illinois has very strict laws, but Indiana does not. And Indiana is immediately adjacent. It's an hour drive from my house. You can go there and get a gun and drive back. There's no border crossing. So
Yeah.
we're going to have to do something very serious here.
Absolutely. In the remaining time that we have left, there was some news out of Fulton County, Georgia yesterday, and there is apparently going to be a partial release of the special grand jury's report on the Trump effort to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia. Walk us through what that means, after we see this partial release. Is there anything we know about that partial release, and what does it mean after that?
We do. The partial release has no names in it, and that's actually the right outcome because until there are indictments, you do not want to sully someone's name without there ever being an indictment and a chance for someone to defend themselves. So the introduction and the conclusion are going to be released, and the part that says that the special grand jury believes that people lied to the grand jury. And the rest of it, the judge said, really needs to be held secret until there are indictments. And it appears from what's going on that there will be indictments. We don't know exactly when, but it's safe to assume because Georgia has a strange law that requires that you go to trial within 2 months after the end of the special grand jury. Remember, this was a special grand jury that can only make recommendations. It can't actually indict. Then their recommendation is presented to a regular grand jury, which will decide whether there's enough evidence to indict or not indict based on the recommendation, but based on the evidence presented. And after that grand jury's It's not the date of indictment. It's the date of the expiration of the grand jury, the regular grand jury. So it's the new one will start on March 1st. So if you did it today or, last week, you would only have a week or more before the grand jury expires. And then you'd have to basically be ready for trial. If you indict on March 1st or whenever the next grand jury is actually sworn in, I don't know what day of the week the first is. It could be a Sunday. But anyway, you would then have till the expiration of that. And that gives everybody involved more time. So I think that she would be waiting until the March grand jury to present evidence for a possible indictment. And it does refer to defendants. So we're expecting more than one person to be named in whatever the indictment is, but we have no idea how many or exactly when or what the charges will be. We're going to have to wait, as much as I would like to know today. But tomorrow,
hopefully eminent means soon.
Introduction and the conclusion and the lying. So it's important, and I will be looking forward to that. I would also say, if you go online and look up Judge McBurney's decision, his order, it's really interesting reading, and it's not. You don't have to be a lawyer to read it. Skip all the legal citations and the footnotes. Just read, particularly starting at about page 3 or 4. The first page is sort of background about how the grand jury gets sworn in, and why this is not an official court record, so that it doesn't have to be published, which an official court record would be subject to the Freedom of Information Act and have to be published. But then it gets into more substantive stuff, and it's an interesting read. So if you Google that or use Bing, hey, should we talk about Bing, which is now supposed to be a real
Bing?
Really? Yeah.
Oh, well, I can tell you no Gen Z uses Bing.
Believe me, I don't use Bing, but supposedly it has now overtaken Google as being a great way to do search. I had it at one point on my Kindle, my Amazon Fire tablet, and it was horrible, absolutely terrible. I mean, I would only use Chrome, but I'm going to try it again. So
it's kind of like ChatGPT, but even better. I'm told, because it's an artificial intelligence boosted, I guess, search engine. But it's even, it's even better than ChatGPT. So imagine how good ChatGPT is, and it can even be more responsive and give you more answers than that. So it's I don't know if I would be using Bing after that, but maybe you'll have more people. It is popular, I guess.
I don't know. It seems. I think it's worth trying right now. If it's better than Google, it's worth trying. So let us know, folks, if you try Bing, what you think, what its problems are, and as we all try to adjust to whether Twitter should be the thing we continue to use, or Post News, or Mastodon, or any of the other variety of social media. And I did note that Post News is about to get an app, which would make it so much more usable than it is right now.
Jill, I don't know if you saw this, but kind of goes to the power of ChatGPT. Neil Katyal posted this thing the other day. He's writing this op-ed for the New York Times, and he asked ChatGPT to write an op-ed in the style of Neil Katyal, and it basically got everything. Other than the fact that because the software for ChatGPT only goes up until 2021, so some of the things are outdated, but it wrote it. Neil Katyal said it basically matches his voice to a T. Like, that's exactly what he would have written. Yes, and it was so you see it and you're like, oh my gosh. It's a concern. For I think a lot of classrooms and a lot of English teachers who now students are just going to use ChatGPT to write essays, and it's a really good essay. It doesn't go to things past 2021, but it's pretty good.
Wow. Well, I've been working on a piece about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes.
I'm just about done with it, but I don't know.
Maybe you want to run it past ChatGPT.
I'm not going to use that one. I promise. I'm using the one. Yes. I will only submit the one that I actually wrote, but it might be interesting to see what it comes up with. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
The idea.
technology never fails to amaze. We'll all definitely, hopefully ChatGPT won't be the last time we hear of this. And there's actually a new software created by a Princeton senior called ChatGPT Zero, which is supposed to help English teachers detect if an essay is written by ChatGPT. So hopefully there are measures to make sure that we don't abuse the system. But we thank all of you for tuning into this episode. Hopefully you have gained a better understanding of why Supreme Court elections matter, about why state Supreme Court elections matter and local elections matter. And if you have any capacity between now and April 4th, which is in exactly 7 weeks, go to wisdems.org/volunteer, make some phone calls. If you're in Illinois or any of the surrounding states of Wisconsin, go into the state, knock on some doors, help out. Really, no effort is too small and every volunteer is needed. So hopefully you can do your part to help us save Wisconsin from going to the hands of Republicans. Thanks so much for watching this episode, and we will be back next week with another episode of iGen Politics. Be sure to subscribe wherever, I guess on YouTube and wherever you follow your podcasts for new episodes every Tuesday here on YouTube or every Wednesday on your podcast platform.